From one of the most dangerous animals in Africa to a tiny lovable critter, today we look at 10 animals that ate their owners. Number 10. Picking pugs. A Papillion, Nebraska man decided to end it all by a self-inflicted gunshot wound. This was determined by an autopsy on what remained of his mutilated remains. The body in question was the sole sustenance for Harry and Sally, the deceased man's 2 pug dogs, for the 2 weeks it took to find the man's rotting body. Lacking food and water for 14 days, the pugs did what nature always does: find a way to survive. The pugs required food. Problem solved. What could be more normal than that? The pugs seemed healthy and well-adjusted to officials after their ordeal. They were put up for adoption with a Humane Society representative, noting that they likely weren't traumatized because they don't have memories like people. Number 9. Hog Heaven. Back in 2012, the last thing Terry Vance Garner expected, as a 69-year-old Vietnam veteran-turned-farmer, was to be eaten alive by his own hogs. But Mr. Garner had a run-in with one huge sow the year before. After accidentally stepping on the sow's piglet, the sow turned angrily against him. The violent episode was enough to cause Mr. Garner to consider putting the sow down, but he changed his mind and let it live. It's hard to say if there was any connection between that incident and him being eaten a year later, but it leaves you wondering if this was his fatal mistake. Mr. Garner's hogs were enormous by today's market standards. Several of them reached 700 pounds in size, where a typical market-weight hog reaches 250 to 300 pounds. Even a breeding sow seldom goes over 400 pounds. While domesticated hogs are not known to be as aggressive as feral hogs, they still can be a danger, as the piglet's mother proved. They have their natural instincts still intact. They hide under the surface. Mr. Garner dedicated his life to his hogs and turned his post-Vietnam, post-traumatic stress life around by living on the farm and raising his huge hogs. Unfortunately, in the end, all that they could find left of him were his dentures and a few body parts strewn around the hog pen. Number 8. Karma. An unidentified 65-year-old female animal hoarder from Arkansas passed of hepatitis C in 2015. This in itself could have been a blessing for her trapped animals. The woman's animal hoarding crossed the line into animal cruelty, which makes you wonder if it was some kind of poetic justice. Officials reported that almost 50 malnourished and aggressive dogs ate her body after she passed. Deputies had such a difficult time with the poorly treated and neglected animals that they had to shoot some of them to reach the body of the unidentified, partially chewed woman. Also, a local veterinarian was bitten in the process of trying to help the dogs. In all, 27 dogs were put down to bring the situation under control. 3 years before, officials forced her to part with 103 animals. She was a serial hoarder. Number 7. Cat chow. When a personal caretaker dies, sometimes the person being taken care of dies too. This was the case in 2010, when Herbert Walden apparently had a fatal heart attack at his home in Albion, Pennsylvania. It had taken several days to find his body. 74-year-old Walden was discovered partially eaten by more than a dozen starving cats. The house was filled with trash and did not even have running water. Officials found Walden's mother there. Her shrunken 94-year-old body was decaying in the same disgusting mess. The mother, Jane Walden, seems to have perished from dehydration after Herbert died because he could no longer care for her. The bodies of 4 cats and a dog were removed by authorities, along with the mother and Walden's partially eaten corpse. It is not known when the cats and dogs died. It's hard to think about, but maybe they passed before Walden did. Number 6. Diabetic devouring. Animals' instincts are funny things. They're deeply ingrained in their psyches. They don't seem to be able to fight them. Take this example. James Little, a 61-year-old diabetic, was sleeping. While he slept, his dog chewed off 3 of his toes. Little felt nothing. Why could he feel nothing? One symptom of diabetes is peripheral neuropathy, the lack of feeling in the feet and other extremities, due to the damage that diabetes does to the human nervous system. But what caused the dog to eat Little's toes? Dogs have an instinct to remove lifeless flesh. It's as simple as that. And this canine instinct is strong in dogs who sense the decaying flesh of a neuropathic diabetic foot, so they eat it. This munching helps the foot, believe it or not. at least in the mind of the canine. Other dogs have been known to eat their diabetic owner's feet. It happens. The Shiba Inu dog was temporarily quarantined to make sure it wasn't dangerous. It wasn't, but it was put up for adoption. Little didn't think a lot of its new dietary preferences. Number 5. Dining dogs. In 2011, days after an Indonesian man returned to Jakarta from a 2-week holiday, his neighbor's interest was aroused when Andre Lemboga's luggage was still lined up in front of the house, and a terrible smell emanated from inside. These signs couldn't be good news. The neighbor called the authorities and they responded, gaining entry into the house. This is what they found. Lemboga's 7 dogs, who had been neither fed nor watered for 2 weeks, had decapitated him, partially eaten his body, and strewn the rest of him around the interior of the home. His skull was in the kitchen. The remainder of his body was in front of the house. Having come home on Wednesday, his disembodied body was not found until the following Monday. The dogs had not been fed or watered for 14 days, plus the interval until the neighbor reported the incident. Also discovered in the grisly mess were the bones of 2 other dogs believed to have been cannibalistic victims of the ravenous pack. Number 4. Lunching lizards. In 2002, Ronald Huff was alone in his apartment in Newark, Delaware. Well, not alone exactly. There were 7 Nile monitor lizards there with him. Nile monitor lizards eat meat. They're 6 feet long and they get hungry. Really hungry. All 7 of them. What are they to do you think? You guessed it. There wasn't much of his face left. Officials believe that Huff must have passed due to natural causes, or he would have fought off the Nile monitor lizard attack. Although they seemed to roam freely through the apartment, the lizards didn't appear to pose any real threat on their own. But once their master had passed, they grew hungry, and nature took its course. Hissing Madagascar roaches, a food staple for the Nile monitor lizard, were available in the apartment. But without Huff there to open the roaches' cages and feed them to the lizards, well, you know. The lizards were in surprisingly good shape after they were captured again. They seemed healthy and happy. So was the cat they rescued from the apartment. No problems there. No word on what the cat ate, well, never mind. Number 3. Hungry Hippo. In another case of a military man being fatally ambushed by his pet, South African Army Major Marius Els did not see his 2,600-pound hippo coming. Humphrey the hippo mauled him, biting him many times with razor-sharp teeth, then dragging him into the river where he drowned. Els was in the water for an undetermined length of time. This outcome was highly unexpected. Els, both Army Major and farmer, found the hippo stranded after a flood when Humphrey was only 5 months old. They lived and played together for almost 6 years on the farm. Humphrey lived in his very own specially built dam. The Army Major didn't seem to mind that hippos are regarded as one of the most dangerous animals in the world. Els would ride on the hippo's back and feed him apples, despite those razor-sharp teeth. Humphrey seemed, to Els at least, to be domesticated. There were exceptions to this peaceful domestication, however. Humphrey was accused of killing Els' calves on the farm. He would escape the farm's boundaries and end up disturbing the play on the local golf course until he could be coaxed back into his custom-built dam. Els would laugh these episodes off. Els apparently didn't see the threat to his own life in these undomesticated actions. Inside that cute hippo baby was a world-class danger. Now that baby weighed 1.5 tons and had a world-class temper. A hippo is a fine pet until he bites you. Oh, a hippopotamus is a vegetarian. They won't eat you up, but they can be cranky. Els found out the hard way. Number 2. Snacking spiders. If you suddenly kick the bucket, would you want to be found a week or 2 later with over 200 spiders, thousands of termites, several snakes, and a gecko crawling all over your remains and feeding on you? This was the fate of Mark Vogel, a 30-year-old man from Dortmund, Germany, who was discovered deceased in his uniquely creepy apartment in 2004. Authorities believe that his pet black widow spider, Bettina, bit him, and he subsequently succumbed to his venomous injury. Bettina was not the only creepy crawly in Vogel's apartment. Variously described as either a zoo or a jungle, his menagerie included a wide variety of reptiles, spiders, tarantulas, snakes, and poisonous frogs. Vogel had been dead between 7 and 14 days before being found. He lived a solitary life and never had guests, contributing to the long interval before being located. He was discovered with his body stretched on the sofa. Huge sticky webs draped his chewed corpse. Spiders were everywhere, coming out of both his nose and his mouth. Lizards had torn off large pieces of flesh and taken them back to their nests. So had tarantulas, smooth reptiles, and a host of flies and gnats and other crawling insects. Everything in the apartment was feeding on him and nesting in his remains. The stench was unbearable. Officials determined that most of the insects, spiders, and termites were originally in cages that burst when their heating elements exploded due to lack of maintenance after Vogel's demise. Then the feasting began. Number 1. Adorable attack. In possibly the only recorded instance of human hamster scavenging, a 1995 case study by Forensic Science International details a woman taken by pneumonia. On her face were unusual wounds and marks. The marks were arranged in pairs. Examining them more closely, they could be seen to match up to the teeth of her free-range golden hamster. Odd. While going through the house and all the possessions, the officials opened a drawer of the victim's home. They found the golden hamster's burrow. The burrow was made of human skin, muscle tissue, and fat. Hamsters, as many people already know, are a type of rodent. Rodents of all kinds are infamous for making their burrows inside the chest cavities of human corpses. They even use the hair and clothing of a human victim to line their nest. This hamster rodent was unique in how quickly it foraged for its burrow materials, while the corpse was still fresh. That is unusual. Often rodents wait until everything is dried out and easy to use. This woman's hamster wasted no time. It seems to know what it wanted, and it took it. All by a self-inflicted gunshot wound. This was determined by an autopsy on what remained of his mutilated remains. The body in question was the sole sustenance for Harry and Sally, the deceased man's 2 pug dogs, for the 2 weeks it took to find the man's rotting body. Lacking food and water for 14 days, the pugs did what nature. Number 9. Hog Heaven. Back in 2012, the last thing Terry Vance Garner expected, as a 69-year-old Vietnam veteran-turned-farmer, was to be eaten alive by his own hogs. But Mr. Garner had a run-in with one huge sow the year before. After accidentally stepping on the sow's piglet, the sow turned angrily against him. The violent episode was enough to cause Mr. Garner to consider putting the sow down, but he changed his mind and let it live. It's hard to say if there was any connection between that incident and him being eaten a year later, but it leaves you wondering if this was his fatal mistake. Mr. Garner's hogs were enormous by today's market standards. From one of the most dangerous animals in Africa to a tiny lovable critter, today we look at 10 animals that ate their owners. Number 10. Picking pugs. A Papillion, Nebraska man decided to end it always does. Find a way to survive. The pugs required food. Problem solved. What could be more normal than that? The pugs seemed healthy and well-adjusted to officials after their ordeal. They were put up for adoption with a Humane Society representative, noting that they likely weren't traumatized because they don't have memories like people.